To import a 3D model into Photoshop, you come up to the 3D menu and you choose New Layer from 3D File. When you do, I want you to navigate to the Project Files folder, the Firesprite folder, the Chapter 2 3D Modeling folder, and inside there you'll find a folder called Skull and Bones. And the first thing that I want you to try importing is the Skull and Bones 3D Studio file. Select that, click Open. There we go. We have ourselves a nice little model here. I'm going to select our Object Rotation tool and just drag it around, and you'll see, sure enough, we've got a low polygon skull. We've punched a few teeth out of its mouth to match the bad teeth of our original. And there's a couple of femur bones sticking through the skull as well. We've done a pretty decent job of emulating what we saw in our original. Okay, so now all we need to do is combine this model with the model that we just created, right? Right. So, as we saw before, we just need to make sure that the camera matches the camera of the chalice layer. Whoa, got really big, didn't it? Well, just so happens that this Skull and Bones, by default, is at a completely different scale from the chalice. So we're also going to take advantage of our object snap commands and inherit the object scale and position as well, which sort of leaves us with what you see on screen here. And by this point, you should start to realize how challenging this approach can be. And let's use our widget. We'll bring it out here to more or less bring our element into the part of the scene that we want it. Scale it properly. And this all looks pretty good. And then, once again, confirming that our camera is set to the same camera view. If we select both of these, all we have to do is merge 3D layers, right? Wrong. It's not there. And I hate to tell you this, but in a scenario like this, it never will be there. And the reason for that can be found inside our 3D menu. If we expand this out, you'll see that the scene that we brought in has all these separate elements. The skull, the upper teeth, the jaw, all of these can be turned on and turned off if we like, which is kind of cool. But you'll see that they're set up in a hierarchy, and you see that some elements in that hierarchy are grayed out. While Photoshop allows you to import a model that is set up this way, and this is pretty much how any 3D application is going to export a model with different elements in it. Once it's broken up like this, it kind of breaks the rules of Photoshop, and you can no longer combine this with a Photoshop 3D scene. Sorry, but that's just the way it works. There's nothing we can do. You cannot break the hierarchy in here. You cannot drag these elements around. There's nothing we can do to this imported element to make it suitable to merge down with our chalice. So we're going to delete it, but we're not going to give up. And what I'm going to show you, if we collapse this back out of the way, is a workaround that I've come up with. There may be others, and this may not necessarily be the best way to do it, but it's the only way I've found to do it. So I'm going to show you what I've come up with. And that is, I'm going to create a new document. The size of it doesn't really matter. Even the name of it doesn't really matter, because we're not going to need to keep this document around. And I'm going to create a new layer from 3D file. And instead of importing the Skull and Bones 3D Studio file that I generated out of Cinema 4D, by the way, instead from Cinema 4D, I exported all of the various elements that I want as individual objects. Basically, within Cinema 4D, I turned off all the objects except for the one that I wanted to export, and I saved it out as an OBJ file. It doesn't have to be an OBJ, it just has to be a supported file. I chose OBJ, which is the Lightwave format. And by doing this, I saved out the jaw, the left femur, the lower teeth, the right femur, the skull, and the upper teeth. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to select all of these by shift-clicking on them, and I'm going to choose Open. Now, the result of that is kind of a mess. Everything's all piled up on top of itself here. But you'll see over here on the right, we now have a separate 3D layer for each one of these elements. If we look at the 3D information for any of these elements, it's just a mesh. There's nothing grayed out. Okay? That's very good. First of all, let's change the order of things a little bit so that the skull is down at the bottom of our layers, just above the background, because we're going to be merging things down eventually, and everything inherits the bottommost name. So eventually we want the last name to be skull, just so we don't have to go about renaming things later. And our next step is to take all of these other layers, and you have to do this one at a time, but all of these other layers, and making sure that you have the camera tool selected, come up to the view and choose skull. If you try to shift click and do the same thing, it's grayed out. So you have to do these one at a time. Right femur, view, skull. Lower teeth, view, skull. Left femur, view, skull. Jaw, view, skull. Now, everything on screen is actually at the right scale and the right position for the next step. And the next step is to merge all of these into a 3D object. But once again, we cannot select all of them and do it at once. If we select a whole bunch of different layers and go up to 3D, it's grayed out. So you may despair again, but despair not. If we, instead, we just select 2 layers, in our case, upper teeth and right femur. As long as you do them 2 at a time, you can merge them. Right femur and lower teeth. Merge 3D layers. Lower teeth and left femur. Merge 3D layers. Left femur and jaw. Merge 3D. Jaw, skull. And watch this. Merge 3D. Kaboom. Now everything is behaving as if it's a single 3D object. And using our object rotation tool here, let's rotate this around so that it's facing forward to a neutral position that we want to keep. Let's scale it down a little bit so that it's on screen, about there. Move it to the right, move it up a little bit. And once again, just to confirm, if we open this up, you'll see we have a bunch of different meshes, right? But nothing is grayed out. Nothing is inaccessible to us. And now that we've done this, I want to come up to our 3D menu and choose Export 3D Layer. So we've done all this work. We know it's Photoshop friendly. Let's go ahead and export it from Photoshop. We'll save it into our Skull and Bones folder, and we'll call this Skull and Bones. But just so it doesn't overwrite our 3D Studio Max file, we'll save it as a Collada DAE file. Photoshop really likes this format, and it's the default export format for that reason. We'll accept that. That's just fine. Click Save. And in terms of the texture format, since we're only using Photoshop as a 3D program, let's keep all of the textures as Photoshop files and click OK. I'm going to jump back, Control-Tab to my chalice, and I'm going to do the same thing, all right? With my chalice layer selected, 3D, Export 3D Layer, Collada DAE, my chalice, that's fine. You notice all these other files that were generated. These are the textures, the Photoshop textures that were generated by the export. Well, we're going to get a few more of those as we export our Collada file. Click Save. Photoshop, OK. Now, the reason I did that is that it will make it easier to line up the two objects with each other when I bring them back in. Because right now we've got this chalice that we made, an hour ago, and its coordinate system may not by default match up with the coordinate system of the Skull and Bones that we just made. The best chance we have of them lining up is to bring them both in at the same time. So we'll turn off this chalice layer, and now 3D, new layer from 3D file, come down and choose mychalice.dae and click Open. After a moment, it comes in. You'll notice the perspective is a little bit different. We're perfectly flat across the top, for example. If yours comes in looking completely different, by the way, like it's at a kind of wacky angle, it probably means that somewhere along the line you ended up actually rotating the object instead of rotating the camera view. It can happen, and if that's the case, you might have to retrace your steps a little bit to figure it out. Next, we'll come up to 3D, New Layer from 3D File, and choose skullandbones.dae. Don't use the 3D Studio one, use the DAE file. Click Open. Now this looks promising, but the My Chalice layer and the Skull and Bones layer are still using radically different cameras and coordinate systems, which basically snap to the size of the object as it's brought in to keep it visible. We need to get them into the same coordinate space, and the first thing that we're going to do with our Skull and Bones layer is come over to the Object settings, go back to our Rotate tool just so we can recognize it, and under Position we're going to choose My Chalice. That's the layer that we just brought in. And look at the difference between these two. Well, even that difference isn't what it seems, because we now need to change the camera from the default view to the My Chalice view. Don't pick the Chalice view, pick the view of the imported version of the Chalice. And that gets us back to something that looks a little bit more promising. Now that we've done that, let's just tweak things ever so slightly on the geometry of our skull layer. We're going to have to play with this a little bit probably to get it right. We'll bring it smaller than it is, although not as small as the original. We don't necessarily want to get the proportions exactly matched. I want them to be a little bit exaggerated. But we're going to move our skull down to about here, where the finial just intersects with the crown of the head. I'm not going to use my object axle to move this layer because it's not perpendicular to the screen, and I want to keep things perpendicular. So instead I'm going to come to my object controls and select the Pan Object tool to move it just to the left a little bit. And all this tweaking I'm doing here really isn't going to matter at this stage. It's unlikely that we're going to get this exactly right on the first try. But there's no harm done in doing your best in terms of at least lining it up right to left. And once we've done that, we'll select these two layers, come up to 3D, and choose Merge 3D Layers. See, this is available to us now. It wasn't before. Merge 3D Layers. And after a few moments of thinking about it, it looks like we're pretty close to our goal. I think if you come over now and use our object orbit and twist this around, you'll see that we're probably not exactly lined up where we want to be. Our skull is a little bit back from where it wants to be, but all in all, not bad, and that's easy to fix. We'll just undo that move, and then undo another level to undo the merge. And this time, before the merge, let's use the Object Slide tool to very subtly bring the object towards us. Just drag really subtly and try to drag straight up and down to just bring the object towards us. And we'll scale it down just a little bit more from here, just to there. Now once again, select these two layers, 3D, merge 3D layers. Then after a moment, you'll see the results. Once again, let's spin around and see how they joined. And this time, I'm quite pleased with the results. I don't think I need to tweak any further. I've got our skull and crossbones intersecting with our chalice. We've built a complex 3D model. We've got some extraordinary geometry to work with. Quite a bit of it generated just within Photoshop. And of course, it all looks like it's made out of shiny gray putty. Well, that's the topic of our next chapter, where we'll be texturing and lighting our chalice.